Hello, I'm Sheryl McCarthy. Welcome to One to One. Just about everyone can agree that New York City is in the midst of a housing crisis, although just what that means depends on who you talk to. Rents have been skyrocketing for years. Available apartments are scarce. People with moderate to low incomes are paying up to half their total incomes for rent. And the pace of creating new and affordable housing seems to have ground to a crawl. What's to be done to make New York City a place where strivers can afford to come and live and where longtime residents can afford to stay? Mayor Zohran Mamdani made affordability the capstone of his mayoralty campaign, including a promise to freeze rents. Is this even possible? And if so, how? And how can the city create the amount of affordable housing that it desperately needs? Sumathy Kumar, a longtime tenant organizer, is the executive director of Housing Justice for All, an association of tenant-led organizations that is fighting for new laws and policies to protect tenant rights and make housing in New York more affordable. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
You know, as I said, everybody agrees there's a housing crisis, but describe, in your view, what that means.
So 1 in 4 New Yorkers right now is struggling to afford basics like rent, groceries, medicine, and over 100,000 people are sleeping in shelters every night in New York City, and even more people are crowded in apartments, overcrowded, couch surfing, etc. So we definitely have a housing crisis. People are struggling to pay rent. They're paying 50% or more of their income in rent, and everybody from all sorts of income levels seems to be struggling with it.
Has the city actually been losing affordable housing? Is the amount of the units of affordable housing down from what they were at some previous time?
So over the last few decades, landlords and the real estate industry have actually been taking more and more units out of rent stabilization, out of rent regulation. And so, you know, a lot of our city's housing stock was rent regulated, and rents were going up at a pretty steady pace. But over the last decades, landlords have taken an extraordinary amount of those apartments out of regulation and are charging whatever they want.
Market rates.
Yeah, that's changed very recently, but the damage has been done for a lot of these places, and we're seeing the effects of that.
And you gave the estimate of the number of homeless people. You said about 100,000 possibly. I remember for so many years when I was writing about, the homeless, it was something like 40,000 who believed to be sleeping in city shelters at night. But it sounds like that has really gone up.
Yeah, it's gone up, and that 100,000 number is also probably an undercounting, given all of the people who are doubled up or in overcrowded apartments or just feeling housing insecure, couch surfing. So the number is probably much higher than what we even know.
What do you think? What do you think is the reason when we talk about the rent stabilized apartment, the sort of the housing under rent control, the number has gone down. But why do you think such a surge in homeless people? What do you think has contributed to that?
I think the rent has gone up, Rent has just become more expensive, and people can't afford to live here anymore. It's just hundreds of thousands of people have been leaving the city because they can't afford to live here over the last few years. And even more are just, they're staying here, but now they can't find a place to live.
Yeah. So tell me about your organization. What's your mission? Who belongs to it? What you do?
Yeah, so Housing Justice for All is a coalition of tenant organizations from across the state that are fighting for universal rent control, for social housing, and an end to homelessness. So we knit together groups from Buffalo to Brooklyn, all coming together to pressure the state legislature to make sure that it centers tenants.
When we talk about affordable housing in the city, do we necessarily mean housing that is subsidized by the government? Is that basically what we're talking about?
It depends in different ways, and I think it's true that for a long time certain neighborhoods have blocked housing from being built. I think there's new ballot measures that were passed in this past election that could change some of that. And I think what people really want to see is that housing is actually affordable to people. And that does mean that the government needs to step in and help with some kind of funding to make it all work, whether that's rental assistance for the people who live there, or it's capital money to put into building these buildings and making them affordable. And making them permanently affordable, so rent stabilized or rent regulated, so that people have that assurance that what they're getting is something that can last for a long time.
So I gather almost half of New York City residents live in rent-stabilized apartments. The figure that I saw was about 1 million compared to about 1.1 million in market rate housing and about 177,000 in the housing projects. Give me a brief primer on how stabilized housing works.
Yeah, so it's around 1 million rent-stabilized apartments, so around 2.4 million people live in them. And what it means is that you have the right to renew your lease. You have certain rights to stay in your apartment if you're doing everything right and things are going okay. And the Rent Guidelines Board, which is a mayor-appointed board, decides how much or whether your rent goes up every year. And so every year they vote on rent adjustments, so whether the rent should go up 2%, 5%, 0%. And so tenants, rent-stabilized tenants, have an ability to impact that process and to weigh in and say, this is what's going on in our lives, this is what costs we have, these are the rent increases that we can afford or we can't afford. And so it gives tenants power over where they live and a sense of stability. You can pass on a rent-stabilized apartment to your family member if you need to. And so many people in New York see rent-stabilized housing, I think, as this amazing source of wealth, really, that you get to share with your family, that you get to use to put down roots, and that keeps working New Yorkers in the city.
I know that over time, there have been efforts to reduce the number of rent-stabilized apartments. One figure that I read was 138,000 units lost since 1994. How were they lost? Mm-hmm. How were those apartments lost?
So for years, the real estate lobby used their influence to buy politicians in a lot of ways and pass loopholes in the rent stabilization laws that would allow landlords to hike up rents at every chance they got, harass tenants into flipping those apartments, and turning them into market rate apartments. And so what you saw when those laws started to be passed in the 90s up until 2019 is just units getting taken out of regulation and also rents rising across the city and gentrification sweeping across neighborhoods. And so in 2019, we were able to reverse that. And a lot of that is because tenants have really been getting organized, becoming a political force, voting like tenants in these elections, and making sure that the state legislature knows, tenants are 70% of New York City. They're half the state. We are a political majority. And so recently, I think that politicians have taken that seriously and have centered protecting tenants in a lot of their legislation.
Because it used to be that if you are in a rent-stabilized apartment, if your family income reached a certain level, then you were out you were no longer, then were you subject to market rent if
So what used to happen is once the rent reached a certain threshold, that unit was taken out of regulation.
Okay.
And so what that did is give real estate, give landlords this like finish line to get to. And so they would use every tool in their toolbox and intense harassment in a lot of cases to drive the price up so that they can kick someone out and then have a market rate apartment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I gather that, and I think if you made some capital improvements if the landlord made some capital improvements to the apartment, I don't know, did that affect their rent stabilization? I guess that could affect the rent, and once the rent got to a certain point, then it could have been out.
Yeah, so there's lots of different ways that landlords used, different loopholes, different laws to try to raise the rent. And at the end of the day, what happened is that we lost all this affordable housing.
Yeah.
And now we're in this situation where, we have the housing crisis that we do. And for so many people, rent stabilization is just this basic thing that keeps you in your neighborhood and in your city. And it's so important to so many people, and that's why we really have to keep it whole now that we've won these changes and made it something that is stable.
You talk about the changes that you've made. I gather one big step forward was the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act of 2019. Mm-hmm. What did that do?
So what it did is really make rent stabilization whole again after the real estate industry had poked all of these holes in it. And so it set things back to the way they were, where you could reliably say, yes, I live in a rent-stabilized apartment. I understand that my rent increases are mostly going to be decided by the Rent Guidelines Board and not by, all of these tricks that landlords were trying to pull. And that it made the program work again, and I think we've seen that over the last few years.
Mayor Eric Adams had a program talked about a program called the City of Yes. I never really knew what that was or what that was meant to accomplish, or if it did accomplish anything. What can you tell? Can you tell me anything about the City of Yes and whether that went anywhere?
I mean, so I think it's a series of small changes that would allow the city or allow more housing to be built. And I think ultimately, like things like zoning reform, things like these smaller changes to how buildings can be built are fine, but what it's really going to take to actually build the amount of affordable housing that we need to get us out of this crisis is government action, is the state and the city putting significant amounts of money into the building and operating of housing and into rental assistance to keep that housing affordable. And so that's why we're asking for the state to really invest in social housing and in models like Co-op City and Mitchell-Lama that have worked before to keep people housed and stably housed, and to be able to do that at scale, because some of these smaller changes are just not going to reach the scale that we need to solve the housing crisis we're in.
Well, so Co-op City, how would you classify that? Is that rent stabilized, or is that what is that exactly?
Yeah, it's part of the Mitchell-Lama program, so it's co-ops, and it's given people a lot of stability and a place to call their home, to raise their families, to pass things down, and I think we've seen many people want something like that,
So Mitchell-Lama are all co-ops? Are they all co-ops?
There's a mix.
Yeah, okay.
This stuff is unfortunately complicated.
Okay,
lots of layers.
okay. But places like that are big, and you want the city and the state to step up. Is there federal money involved in those complexes and as well?
I mean, when it comes to public housing, we need federal money.
Yeah.
We need federal action. We
Yeah.
need to change our federal situation.
Right.
To be able to do that. But there's still a lot that the state can do to put money into public housing and to put money into affordable housing generally.
Yeah. The mayor ran a campaign based in part on freezing rents. And a lot of people said, oh, yeah, right. What was he talking about?
Yeah, it's very possible. I think it's going to happen this year. He means freezing the rent for rent-stabilized tenants. So for those 2.4 million tenants who live in rent-stabilized housing, this year the Rent Guidelines Board is going to go through its process and vote on how much or whether the rent should go up for those tenants. And we're going to be demanding a rent freeze like we have. And the mayor has stated that he's in support of a rent freeze. He appoints all of the members of the board. I think that we can hope and feel pretty confident that we're going to get a rent freeze for those 2 million.
Or for
tenants.
this year? Okay. All right. Tell me about some of the specific policies that your organization is prioritizing.
So we will be fighting for a rent freeze.
Right.
And we'll be fighting on the state level to expand rent stabilization to people who don't have it right now. And so right now that's upstate cities, people who have been fighting for rent stabilization for a long time and who don't have it, even though there's a housing crisis upstate, just like there's one in New York City. So we're working to expand rent stabilization or the opportunity to opt into rent stabilization for those upstate cities this year. And then, like I said, with the homelessness crisis that we have, with the affordability crisis that we have, people need money and support in paying the rent. And so we're fighting at the state level for the Housing Access Voucher Program, which is a rental assistance program for homeless New Yorkers and people who are close to homelessness.
Is that something new? Is that something?
So we won a pilot for it last year. It's not enough money. It's only $50 million that were allocated for it last year. And we need much more to solve the need that we have in front of us. And
How does that work? That's for homeless people?
For people who are homeless or at risk of homelessness.
And how does that work?
So it's set to be implemented in March.
Okay.
But people, it's not enough right now. The pot is very small. But our goal is to be able to expand it so that people who need can apply for it and get that rental assistance. It's like a state version of Section 8.
Oh, I see. It's sort of like a voucher. Okay, okay. What are the historic policies that have existed in, New York City, New York State, that you think have helped to create the current housing shortage that we have?
So I think in terms of decreasing the amount of affordable housing that we have, I do think that the real estate industry's poking of holes in rent stabilization law led to a huge loss of affordable housing over the last few decades, from the 90s onwards, where we see this huge wave of gentrification, rents rising, people no longer being able to afford to live here. So I do think that's one of the biggest factors. I also think in general, the real estate lobby's influence over our politicians has led to these tax breaks for luxury housing, lots of glass towers going up that don't house working people who make the city run.
Yeah, it is amazing, and I had a guest on who talked specifically about the towerization of New York City, that in almost every vacant lot or formerly vacant lot in New York City, there seems to be a skyscraper going up, and they're getting taller, and towers of glass and steel, and I guess concrete that are going up, and almost occasionally there'll be a few units in there for supposedly called affordable, but they're mostly very, very expensive apartments.
Yeah.
So you have, what you're going up is housing, and I often wonder who can afford to live in those buildings. But you're getting a lot more housing, but not housing that's affordable for most people. Are there some cities that you can point to that you think have been successful in really making progress on making affordable housing available to the people who need them?
So a few years ago, I was able to travel to Vienna with other tenant organizers and active tenants in the movement. And we learned a lot about their housing system there, where 1 in 4 people in Vienna live in social housing. So they live in permanently affordable, resident-controlled, publicly funded housing.
Tell me, what's social housing? That's a new term for me.
Yeah. So exactly what I said. It's housing that's permanently affordable, has public funding attached to it, and has some level of resident control, whether that's rent regulation or it's a co-op where residents are making decisions about where they live. But the core of it is that it's a permanently affordable and publicly funded type of housing that can give people stability for the long haul. That's also high quality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like Mayor Mamdani, you come out of the democratic socialist movement. I think there are a lot of people who don't know what that means. And so why don't you explain to us what that means and how it caught your imagination?
Yeah. So to me, democratic socialism means that people should have control and democracy in all aspects of their lives, not just at the ballot box, but at their workplace, at their homes, so that you can have control over where you live, where you work. And we value democracy so much at the ballot box and in our electoral system, but so much of our lives are about going to work and being in our homes, and those places are not democratically controlled. They're controlled by a handful of billionaires, a handful of people who make decisions over our lives and take all of the work that we do, the rent money we pay, and use it to enrich themselves. And so democratic socialism is about us all having a say over these things that are so important for our lives, our workplaces, the economy, our homes, our communities, alongside our electoral system.
Are there places where you see that at work?
There's lots of experiments to point to around the world, and you can look at different countries in Europe and different experiments that are happening across Latin America in some places. But honestly, we're building this right here in New York City right now, right? To see what, under Mayor Mamdani, what can be possible, how much control and how much say regular workers can have over their lives in this new era. And that it's not just about your workplace, but it's also about where you live, your neighborhood, your community, and your homes. And so I think as the next 4 years progress, we'll see people being able to have more and more of a say over what happens to their lives.
So you've been working in this whole area of affordable housing and being an advocate for tenants for a while. How did you get involved?
So I got involved because I'm a tenant in New York City. I've seen how our city is just getting taken away from us as working people who live here. And when you walk down the street in places across the city, I live in Bed-Stuy, I see gentrification happening every day. It's the most present thing for people. And yet, tenants are 70% of the city. We have power if we actually come together and organize. And so the idea of being able to join a mass movement of people who are just like me and also very different from me was really the thing that pulled me in. and also to have an actual say over my home. I used to live in an unregulated apartment where I didn't know how much the rent would go up every year, or whether my landlord would decide to renew my lease or decide it's over.
Kick you out, right.
And I joined the fight to pass good cause eviction at the state level a few years ago, and now that apartment, that has good cause eviction. So it has had a material benefit over my life and the lives of thousands of other people. And I've seen that echoed in many different people in the housing movement, where we come into something because the rent is too high or we're having a problem with our landlord, become part of this movement of amazing tenants from around the city who really care about their homes and are then transformed, win amazing things for our homes, and then stick around because there's so much more to win and there's so many more people who need that stable housing. And that's really the backbone of the tenant movement, these amazing fighters who have won for themselves and now want to win for everybody.
Well, certainly to have affordable housing for everyone is a huge issue. It's a huge issue in New York City, something people care about a lot. And I appreciate that people like you and Housing Justice for All are fighting for it. So thank you so much.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. I'd like to thank Sumathy Kumar, Executive Director of Housing Justice for All, for joining me today. To learn about our upcoming shows, you can follow us on Instagram at 121 CUNY TV, and you can watch the show on the go by downloading the CUNY TV app. So for 121 and CUNY TV, I'm Sheryl McCarthy.